Okay, so we're going to move on to Polycletosis Doriforos, which means spear bearer. And this is actually a Roman copy from Pompeii, Italy, of a bronze statue, 450 to 440 BCE, and it's 6 feet 11 inches high. So it's a little over life size. Most men didn't make it to 6 feet high, definitely not close to 7 feet high. So the Doriforos means spear bearer, and this one is definitely one of the best copies of the original work by Polykletos, the Greek sculptor. And you can see these kind of chunks here of marble that are kind of clunky, that weren't originally on the original bronze, but they were brought in for stability. Because this is a different material of marble, it required more stability than, say, bronze. So they added that in for stability. So this is kind of the ideal state of a nude male athlete, and it's actually Polykletos named it canon. So his name for it was canon, and this is a reference to the strict set of rules that the statue follows, much like the canons that the Egyptians used for their figural representations, and even like the canons that the Greeks used in their temple building. Same thing goes for this statue and its proportions, and all of the different proportions of this body are based on his own, Polykletos' own canon, and that's why he named it that. And it's kind of a culmination of the evolution of Greek statuary from the archaic and into the classical age, basically. So starting off with, some of those archaic kuros and statues that were kind of more geometric and primitive, up into this time here where, it's really reaching a culmination of a perfection in a way. So you can see the weight shift is more pronounced than ever before, and he really imposed order on every part of the sculpture to make it absolutely perfect. And he used a lot of counterbalances or contrapposto. And if you look at this sculpture, it seems to be, a very casual pose that he's in. But if you look a little closer, it's actually a pretty complex system of counterbalances that kind of create this harmony. So the right side of the figure has basically these kind of straight limbs running through, they're just straight and somewhat flexed. And then these ones have on this side, on the other side of his body, and on the left side of his body, he has more of dynamically bent limbs. And then if you want to look at it like this, you can see diagonally, you have one straight limb and one bent limb, and the same goes for this side. So we have a lot of opposites going on here in what we call contrapposto or counterbalances. And he also once held a spear, and his head actually turns to the right while his hips twist to the left, which is another example of a counterbalance that's going on in this piece. And this dynamic and subtle asymmetrical balance creates kind of a harmony in opposites, is how that kind of works. And a system of counterbalances is kind of the main characteristic of the Polycletan style. So Polykletos really did serve to inspire a lot of artists after him, and they kind of used his system of counterbalances, and they call that the Polycletan style. So, okay, moving on. So we're going to talk about the Athenian Acropolis a little bit. So the Athenian Acropolis, which is the area on the top of the hill near Athens, had been destroyed during the Persian invasion. The Persians came and tried to defeat Athens and Greece, actually. And the leader was Pericles. The Athenian leader was Pericles. And, after the defeat of the Persians, he began a large-scale building project on the Acropolis at Athens to kind of bring it back from where it was at after the war. And, shortly after the Persian War, the Greeks formed an alliance for mutual protection against the Persians and from against the barbarians, because the Persians almost were able to defeat Greece. So they formed an alliance, the Greeks did, all of the territories, and they called this the Delian League. And at its outset, every member had an equal vote, but Athens gradually assumed a dominant role in the Delian League. And in 450 BCE, or thereabouts, the treasury was actually transferred to Athens, and Pericles, the ruler of Athens during this time, used that money to embellish and build this Acropolis, or rebuild the Acropolis at Athens. And in reality, the money should have really gone to the common good of the allied Greek states, but it actually went to the Acropolis at Athens, and it's really kind of, it didn't come from the fruit of the Athenian democracy, but it actually is kind of a byproduct of tyranny and abuse of power. So the Acropolis of Athens is really just kind of was built on kind of Pericles stealing money from the Delian League. So here's the head of Pericles, which is a body, or is a Roman copy. It's not a true portrait, it's an idealized image, which made him appear godlike. So we're going to kind of skim over this one, but it's made out of marble, 429 BCE. And here's the aerial view of the Acropolis as it is today. And definitely the main building on the Acropolis was the Parthenon. And we did touch on this architectural work earlier when we kicked off the chapter, but we'll go into it in more detail. And so the Parthenon was dedicated to the to the goddess Athena, and they call her Athena Partheneos, which means Athena the Virgin. And it doesn't include an altar for her worship, so it's not really a temple in the strict sense. So construction began around 447 BCE and was completed in under 10 years. And this is for the Parthenon. And sculptural decoration for the Parthenon took longer to complete. It was finished in around 15 years after the construction began. So the sculpture actually took longer to build than the building itself. And here's a restored view of the Acropolis at Athens. So we can see the Parthenon here, the Propylaea here, the Pinacotheke here, the Erechtheion here, and then the Temple of Athena Nike is here. And I think that's the smallest temple in the Acropolis, is the Temple of Athena Nike. So the greatest architects and sculptors really focused their attention on the construction and the decoration of these four buildings shown with the numbers on them in this slide. And it's been through a lot. It's pretty amazing this even is still in existence today. So the Parthenon at one time was converted into a church in the Middle Ages, and then it became a mosque later on when the Ottomans conquered Greece. And then the Christians removed the huge statue of Athena inside the Parthenon, and the Ottomans even added a tower to it at one point. And then there was even a rocket that blew out the center of the Parthenon at one point during a conflict. Statues were smashed and removed, and all sorts of damage was done. So many of the surviving statues are actually in England today. And even corrosive emissions from cars and pollution in factories are kind of decomposing the ancient marble. So it's been through a lot. So the Parthenon, despite being damaged, has endured. And most of its colonnade, it's peripteral, so it's just one singular column around the outside, is still standing. And Iketenos was the architect, and it's thought that Killicrates assisted him in the role as contractor, supervising the construction of the building. So Phidias carved the monumental statue of Athena that was in the cella, and then he also oversaw the temple's sculptural decoration, and he may have even overseen the sculptural decoration of the entire Athenian Acropolis, not just the Parthenon, but the other temples that were there as well. And the Parthenon is really the culmination of a lot of research done by Greek architects. It's basically an example of a Doric design, temple design, that embodies the perfect proportions that the Greeks were really striving for and that they loved. The columns were spaced perfectly. They were also just the right width. And to achieve these beautiful proportions, there is a mathematical expression, and even the number of columns on every side of the building follow that. And even the width of the columns are determined by this particular mathematical equation. Even with that, the Parthenon does have some irregularities that we'll talk about. Let me pause this because somebody's getting a phone call. Okay, so one of the irregularities that we're going to talk about that the Parthenon has is that the stylobate, which is the base that the building rests on, curves upward at the center. Just on the sides of the building, kind of forming a a dome, and the curvature actually carries up into the entablature above. So the entablature is up above. So there's a bit of a curve, a dome to the building. And the columns lean inward slightly on the corners of the building, and they're 2 inches thicker than the rest of the columns. So I think the columns on the corners lean in and they're 2 inches thicker than the other columns. And some speculate that the curvature of the horizontal lines and the slight tilting of the vertical lines create kind of a dynamic balance in the building, a kind of contrapposto, but done in architecture. And it gave it maybe possibly a greater sense of life. Another theory that is supported by historical texts actually claims that the irregularities found in the Parthenon are present to compensate for optical illusions. So Iketenos, the architect, believed that the stylobate, if it was laid out on a level surface, it would appear to sag in the middle from a distance. And then also he believed that the columns at the corners of the building would appear thinner if they were surrounded on more sides by sunlight, because they are on the corner. So he thought that if he made those corner columns 2 inches thicker than their neighbors, that would kind of even things out optically. So basically he's just trying to, what they think may be happening with these irregularities is that Iketenos was trying to kind of compensate for these illusions that might be happening, these optical illusions that might be happening. So the Parthenon also has one other irregularity. The outside is Doric, but on the interior, the back room had 4 tall, slender Ionic columns. And the inner frieze that ran around the top of the cella was also Ionic. And some think that the fusion of the Doric and Ionic kind of reflects the Athenians' belief that the Ionians of the Aegean Islands in Asia Minor were descendants of the Athenian settlers and were therefore their kin, or it may symbolize that Athens is the leader of all Greeks. They're not quite sure, but definitely there is probably a reason why there's a blending of Doric and Ionic orders in one temple. And actually throughout the Athenian Acropolis, not just in the Parthenon, you'll actually see a mixture of Doric and Ionic elements in the different sculptures. So it's not totally unique to the Parthenon on the Athenian Acropolis, this mixture of Ionic and Doric elements. So if we take a look at this piece here by the master sculptor Phidias, it's called Athena Partheneos. It was found in the cella of the Parthenon on the Acropolis, 438 BCE. It's made out of, I believe, gold and ivory. And it's definitely the most important statue that was inside of the Parthenon. Partheneos means virgin, so, Athena the Virgin. And this is an extremely expensive piece to make. It was 30 feet tall, and in order to accommodate her huge size, the Parthenon actually had to be made wider than it usually would have been. Instead of 6 columns on the end, it has 8 columns. So it's not following that super strict canon. I mean, it is, but not to a T, because they had to make it slightly wider because of the statue of Athena Partheneos inside. So she has a shield, a spear, a helmet, and she actually holds Nike, who is the winged personification of victory. So we can see Nike here, her shield and her spear. And this is basically, Nike kind of, the fact that she's holding Nike symbolizes, that the Greeks defeated the Persian because this was still really fresh in the Athenian mind during this time. And she stands on an elevated platform, and it really has depictions of centaur maki, and also